Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to begin by thanking my friend, the ranking member, Senator Whitehouse, for helping plan and hold this hearing today. And I'd like to thank the expert witnesses that we're going to hear from in the first and second panels. In the interest of time, we are facing a number of competing hearings this afternoon. So in the interest of time, we're going to dispense with opening statements. We'll enter your statements into the record in full. I'm going to dispense with my opening statement. Senator Whitehouse, do you want to make a few remarks?
I'll make brief remarks. First of all, thank you for this hearing, Senator Hawley, and thank you for your interest. I want to thank you for inviting back officials from the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security, as well as a separate panel of distinguished efforts to speak about the data security threats confronting our nation. The title of this hearing, in my view, doesn't quite capture the nature and the scope of these threats. The problem is bigger than Beijing and broader than any one industry. Our nation faces an onslaught of cybercrime. Last year, the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center received nearly 470,000 complaints of Internet crime, leading to over $3.5 billion in losses, a 20% plus increase since just 2018. These threats come not just from criminals, but from nation states. Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea particularly have all sponsored cyber attacks against American enterprises. A lot more than our personal data is at risk. Bad actors can paralyze businesses, hospitals, and governments with ransomware attacks. They can disable thousands of computers through denial of service attacks. They can gain remote access to our power and water treatment plants. International criminal syndicates make big business of this too, often seemingly with license from nation states. The federal government must lead the way in defending against and deterring the full array of cyber threats. Today's hearing gives us the opportunity to look at what we know about the cyber threats facing our country and consider what more we should be doing. Here are a few places we could start. I've long advocated for the FBI and DOJ to investigate and aggressively prosecute cyber criminals, and I am pleased to see the recent indictments of state-sponsored hackers. We need to make sure that federal agencies have the technical expertise, resources, and legal authority to pursue these cases. We need to build our defensive capacity, the Nist framework, laying out voluntary best practices and industry standards for the private sector entities that operate and maintain critical infrastructure, was a groundbreaking idea in 2014. But we still don't know if it's working. It ought to be stress tested and its efficacy assessed and the plan updated. We can only defend ourselves against threats if we know we're out there. The president should designate a cybersecurity discloser-in-chief, empowered to declassify government information and share it with state and local governments, the private sector, and the general public. I've been happy to see DHS moving to share more information about recent cyber attacks faster. Finally, the U.S. need not act alone. In an international coalition of the willing could agree to common international norms against cybercrime, state-supported hacking, and intellectual property theft, and hold accountable those states that transgress. We cannot let the bad actors frustrate our efforts to reach consensus with our allies about permissible state behavior in cyberspace any more than we would allow the burglars to advise us on defending our home security measures. I look forward to discussing these issues, and I thank the chairman for calling the hearing.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Now I will introduce the witnesses. Mr. Clyde Wallace is Deputy Assistant Director of the Cyber Division at the FBI, where he oversees Cyber Division operations and the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force. Mr. Wallace has held leadership positions in the FBI's Criminal Investigative Division, Cyber Division, Human Resources Division, and many different FBI offices. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Wallace. Mr. Brian Ware is Assistant Director for Cybersecurity at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, where he leads department policy development in support of department-wide efforts to reduce national risks. He focuses on critical infrastructure cybersecurity, federal network security, countering cybercrime, and improving the security and resilience of the global cyber ecosystem. Mr. Ware, thank you for being with us. And Mr. Adam Hickey is Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the National Security Division of the Department of Justice, where he oversees the Counterintelligence and Export Control Section and the Foreign Investment Review Section. Among other things, he supervises investigations and prosecutions of foreign state-sponsored computer intrusions and attacks, as well as enforcement of the Foreign Agents Registration Act and the division's foreign investment security reviews. Thank you, Mr. Hickey, for being with us. And I'll now swear all of the members as we begin. Would you stand and raise your right hands with me? You affirm that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. Okay. Very good. Well, let's begin the questions, and again, we'll enter your statements into the record. Thank you all for being here. Let me say, as we begin, that we face a major security threat from China. This includes our economic security, it includes our military security, and it certainly includes our cybersecurity and our own personal data security. We now know that Chinese officials were behind the Equifax breach from 3 years ago that exposed the personal financial information of 148 million Americans. It's almost half the country. We know that China requires businesses that operate in the country to share data with the Beijing government. And we know that Chinese companies are actively trying to scoop up the personal data of American citizens. And on that note, let's talk for a second about TikTok. TikTok was the most downloaded app of 2019, more than any other app in the country. More teenagers are on TikTok now than use Facebook. It counts millions and millions and millions of Americans as users. But it is owned by a Chinese company that includes Chinese Communist Party members in leadership, and it is required under Chinese law to share user data with Beijing. And TikTok has admitted that it has sent user data to China. To put it bluntly, this is a major security risk for the American people. And what kind of data is TikTok collecting as it runs on our phones? A heck of a lot more than you would think. Images, of course, that users post. But TikTok also collects information about the messages that you send, about the apps that you use, the other apps on your phone. It collects the sites that you visit. It collects your search history. It collects your keystrokes. It collects your location data. It stores all of this and maybe lots more. And I can tell you, as the father of 2 small children who already have many of their friends on social media, even though they're quite young, I find this absolutely horrifying, and we know that it's a national security risk. Since our last hearing on this subject, the Pentagon, the Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security, and the TSA have all banned their employees and service members from using TikTok on government devices. In fact, the Pentagon even went so far as to say that employees should have their children uninstall TikTok from their personal devices. That's pretty extraordinary. But actually, it's only prudent. And that's why today I'm announcing I will introduce legislation to ban the use of TikTok by all federal employees on all federal government devices. This is a necessary step to protect the security of the United States and the data security of every American. So let me just ask the panel, why are all these government agencies banning the use of TikTok? What are the threats that that company and others like it pose? Mr. Wallace, we'll start with you, and then we can just go down the line. Anyone who wants to contribute. Go ahead, sir.
Sure, absolutely, sir. And couldn't agree more with your points on China's holistic approach to how they're aggregating data. And I think TikTok is one example of an application that the average citizen doesn't understand the implications of what's behind it and what data can flow from an application like that that's basically controlled by a state-sponsored actor, right? I think that lends into the bigger threat that China poses today, and that it's a holistic society approach to the United States, right? It's not just the TikTok application, right? It's the data warehouses that store that data, right? Whether they be here in the United States, owned by the Chinese, or within the Chinese borders themselves where that information is stored. Using front companies to purchase American data to aggregate it, all with the overall objective to aggregate that data into a holistic database, as we know, that can be utilized for many purposes.
Can I just ask you, why is the Chinese government, do you think, so interested in all of this data? I mean, why were they interested in Equifax data? Why are they interested in TikTok data, other data? You know, you would say, well, why do they care about the data of private American citizens?
Well, the ability in large data sets from the cyber perspective is, with modern technology and AI, the ability to data mine through that data, produces vulnerabilities for U.S. citizens, companies, proprietary information for our corporations that are operating both domestically and overseas. It creates a massive vulnerability of information that can be data mined in order to give a competitive advantage.
Very good. Mr. Ware, do you want to add anything to this?
No, I mean, a little bit. I would just say that the collection.
Is your mic on?
Yeah, I'll do that too. The collection of personally identifiable information, the kind of information that you described, presents a lot of risks and a lot of advantages to an adversary. We trade that information, consumers trade that information pretty freely for entertainment or for convenience. I wish we were all more aware of what we were giving up when we did that. There's certainly no place for applications like TikTok on government devices and government networks. But
Why do you say that, Mr. Ware? Can you just expound on that? I mean, what's the particular threat on government devices and government employees, service members?
Well, first of all, I think there's ways that we can find alternatives for whatever feature TikTok provides through some other application. So it's primarily an entertainment platform, probably not necessary on a government device. But beyond that, China has amazing programs now in collection of data and developing artificial intelligence and analytics against that data for purposes that we don't fully know. But when that data is our faces and our voices and our locations and things that are tied very closely to our identities, like our phones are, that should give us great concern.
Mr. Hickey?
Thank you, Senator. The data makes it easier to target people. It makes it easier for an intelligence service to either recruit or hack into systems used by a government employee, a CEO, another high-value target. And you can't just protect the important data, right? Data travels in a set. So when we, as a member of CFIUS, look at an acquisition, we're looking at what data is collected by the U.S. company, what's made available to its foreign acquirer, and in the regs that have recently been adopted by the committee, it's precisely this kind of data that we're concerned with because it enables malicious activity, either recruiting or hacking. It might also make China better at artificial intelligence, right? The larger data sets you have, the ability to cross-reference data sets can improve your AI tools.
Very good. I'd like to come back to the point about CFIUS and your authorities and what more you might need, and maybe we'll have a chance to do that in the second round. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you all for being here. There was a time not too long ago when we were reluctant to prosecute international hackers for fear of diplomatic and business blowback. After a considerable delay, the previous administration did indict a number of Chinese military officials, and that tradition now continues. Are there further authorities that DOJ or the FBI would like in order to more effectively prosecute these cases? Are you able to work around the delays inherent in the LEGAT process? Is there something that the committee can do to be useful to focus the prosecutive effort more effectively for you? And let me start with that question, then I'll go to my second. That's for Mr. Wallace and Mr. Hickey.
Thank you, Senator. I very much appreciate the question. So in my statement for the record, I've identified a number of legislative proposals, but I want to prioritize three of them.
Please.
First is a nationwide breach reporting requirement. One, it would have a number of advantages, including standardized reporting standards for companies and the like. But I would urge the committee and Congress to consider including notification to law enforcement as part of that, because we can't respond to what we can't see. And there are significant disincentives, some cases, to reporting to law enforcement. Right now, when we think about data breach standards, we think only about PII. But PII, notification to someone that their PII was stolen, is not the only type of data asset we ought to be concerned with.
Yeah.
We ought to be thinking about threats to critical infrastructure, export-controlled information, and the like. And DOJ is working on a proposal for such legislation now.
That's one.
Second, addressing insider threats. Right now, in some circuits, we can't effectively prosecute insiders in a company or government officials who misuse their access to a network because of the rulings of certain courts. So fixing 1030 so that we can effectively prosecute those who exceed authorized access is critical.
Okay.
And third, I would say extending the Economic Espionage Act to thefts that occur abroad but impact U.S. companies. Right now, if the trade secret isn't stolen from the U.S. or isn't stolen by a U.S. person, we lack the authority to prosecute it. Thank you for the interest.
You've given us some good tasking. My second question is for Mr. Ware, and it has to do with not only TikTok, but a whole variety of potential threats that come when Americans and civilians in other countries take up an application that may come with a payload of some kind that we don't really want them to have. It has always struck me, we've been at this for some years. In the previous administration, there was a considerable effort to try to negotiate international cyber security standards. And there was a relatively persistent effort to try to include Russia and China in those negotiations, which to me is like letting the burglars negotiate what your burglar alarm system is going to look like. I don't care that they're not in the room. I'm actually happier if they're not in the room. And between the Five Eyes and our EU friends and other countries that are not malign actors in this space, it would seem to me that there's critical mass out there to develop some standards so that an app with the downside of TikTok and other apps that may have even worse payloads buried in them never get to market the same way they do, because there is a much broader curtain of defense around a coalition of the willing. And I'm wondering what the current status is of your efforts at Homeland Security to build that coalition of the willing and depress the strategy of loading up apps with malign payload.
Yeah, there's a lot to that, and I'm not sure that standards are the flexible mechanism to do it. I think they certainly play a role. We do work very closely with our allies, particularly the Five Eyes, as you mentioned. And maybe what we should be doing, and I think we are having these conversations, is extending on some of the successes that we're having with the IT supply chain working group, which we have, for that task force, we have 20 of the largest telecommunications companies in the U.S., 20 of the largest IT services companies in the U.S., and 20 federal agencies to work together to share information on our supply chain risks. To use the app concept more broadly to be software, hardware, the things that we're buying and that we're installing in corporate networks and in government networks. I believe that body has been an effective one to communicate on risks that any one of those industries or participants are seeing, so that we can all see that, so we can develop some best practices together. That is supporting analysis that's being done inside of CISA's National Risk Management Center, and also feeds the FASC. The FASC is just getting off the ground, really, but the FASC is going to give us the mechanisms that we need to keep things off of or remove things from government networks, similar to the way that we've used bots before.
I'm going to interrupt only because my time is running out.
Yes.
I would like to encourage you to do that. I think there's bipartisan support for that kind of an effort. In the same way that you cannot buy a package of cigarettes because it's a dangerous instrumentality without reading the Surgeon General's warning on the side, in the same way that you can't buy a mattress without the consumer tag attached to it, there is a way in which the well-intentioned countries of the world could surveil these various apps, particularly the ones that are becoming rapidly popular, and figure out what warning label should be attached to them, and then simply make the public know what the hazards are here. I would really encourage us to pursue that effort. I know that would require the Department of State as well, and the LEGAT offices from DOJ and FBI. But it seems to me that there is a coalition of the willing to be assembled. Things like Tic-Tac give us the example of the hazardous product that is unmarked to most people. And you don't have to have very fixed standards to simply agree to, like, let's do the 10 worst ones, and then we'll do the 100 worst ones after that, and start to try to weed the garden a little bit. Because at the moment, the weeds are growing without, in my view, an international strategy to get them out. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Senator Ernst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do appreciate the conversation that we're having this afternoon. It's been very, very fascinating. So thank you, Chairman, for doing this. All of this data that we're talking about really just continues to feed into China. Lots and lots of data, and more and more of this data is being stored in China, China is absolutely using it to build up to an artificial intelligence lead. And the United States has privacy laws. China doesn't. China goes beyond collecting their own data, and what they're doing is illegally keeping all of our data and infringing on our right to privacy. So for the entire panel, if you would, how can we prevent U.S. companies from unknowingly or voluntarily contributing to China's rise in AI? A stab at it, at least. Thanks.
Well, so we have fairly specific authorities, Senator, and so I think we do think about where data goes when we review foreign investment, right, through CFIUS. Generally, we take a laissez-faire approach to a lot of things in the private sector, and that has worked out very well for us. And I don't assume that all data collected by American companies is going to China, but generally, there isn't much regulation of where companies put data. And at DOJ, we don't say you've got to keep the data here, just please store it someplace safe. So our recommendation would be pick a country that subscribes to the Budapest Convention, one of the 60-some signatories, which I think Senator Whitehouse is a good starting list of the countries that adhere to basic norms in cyberspace. And keep your data there as opposed to an authoritarian country, and China's certainly not the only one.
Yeah, do we have any idea how many of our companies are storing their data in China? I mean, does anybody really have a handle on that?
Of American citizens? I don't know that. I think you'd have to look at their terms of service. Some companies disclose where they store data. Other companies do not.
Okay. Moving beyond just joint ventures in China, here at home, we're seeing an unprecedented level of foreign direct investment from China. I think many countries are experiencing this around the world. But while the passage of FIRMA sought to stifle Chinese intent to harm our national security, there are still some unknowns within implementing reforms to the vetting process. So previous CFIUS rules didn't include venture capital investments, and there was a minority investment loophole. Chinese investors associated with the military, for instance, could employ these shortcuts and kind of fly under the radar and gain access and influence over U.S. businesses with sensitive and critical technologies. So again, for the entire panel, how are we working with the Treasury Department to identify those bad actors?
So fortunately, Senator, FIRMA, the 2018 legislation, broadens CFIUS's jurisdiction, so we can reach investments that are non-passive and non-controlling that would give an acquirer access to sensitive technology or sensitive personal data. In our regs, we lay out what we mean by sensitive personal data. So just by doing that, we identify for lawmakers, policymakers, and the public what categories of data we should be most concerned with. And now we've created a regime where we can review even those non-controlling investments to ensure that U.S. person privacy and security isn't put at risk by those investments.
Go ahead, thank you. Yes, did you have any comment, Mr. Wallace?
Well, just from an investigative standpoint, looking at the wholesale China threat that's upon us, the FBI has taken kind of that position that we're the indispensable partner that sits kind of, straddling national security and the criminal branch. And we have the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force, or the NCIJTF, where we have over 30 agencies that are co-located, including Treasury. So when we come across these instances of front companies and or supply chain, entering into the supply chain, certainly around the DIB or the Defense Industrial Base and the clear defense contractors, we sit side by side with those agencies to assist so that we can work together in a holistic approach. So it's not just specific indictments against those individuals, but also how can we get sanctions the whole of government approach to how we're going to look at the threats emanating from China.
Absolutely, and we do appreciate that collaboration. Thank you very much. And we do have a number of American companies out there that have really given into Chinese asks for their own interests. And Chinese espionage is more than a threat to our personal liberties. Of course, it harms our national defense. And of course, I think all of us are very interested in that area. And Mr. Hickey, what industries do you think would be most susceptible to espionage?
I would start with the industries where China has said they want to achieve dominance. So I would look at Chinese industrial plans like the Made in China 2025 initiative, which identifies 10 sectors, and say, well, if that's where they want to get ahead, if you make products or develop a technology within those sectors, you're a more likely candidate for at least IP theft. Then we've talked about PII theft, so it's a different motivation behind that, I think. And then in terms of leverage, I'm concerned about a company that does business here, but that is ultimately accountable to a parent company in China and susceptible to leverage by the Chinese government. And so I think those who do business with those companies may be exposing themselves to an actor that could be co-opted. Our cases lay out ways in which employees of Chinese companies doing business here have been co-opted, or employees of American companies have been recruited if they're working abroad or here. And so I think the answer to that, by the way, is not China-specific. It's to develop security plans that are essentially country neutral, have an insider threat program, have a strong cybersecurity program which will protect you from threats wherever they're coming from, regardless of nationality.
I think that's a really great point, Mr. Hickey, is that while we are talking a lot about China today, it is understanding how do we protect not just against China, but some other bad actors as well. So thank you to our panelists very much for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. First, let me tell you, don't take it personally that Apple wouldn't show up today. It was 10 years ago in this very room that they declined my invitation to come and talk about their complicity in the violation of human rights in China, and sadly it's gotten worse since then, so don't take it personal. So what we know is this: the Russians have set out to invade our election space. They tried it in 2016. We thought they were going to try it again in 2018, and we answered in a variety of ways, some of which we can't discuss openly in this room, with the measure of success in 2018. But we've been warned by intelligence agencies across the board, don't assume they won't be back in 2020 in some capacity. Illinois was one of the first states that the Russians hacked into in 2016. They took control of 76,000 pieces of information and voter files for 76,000 individuals, and fortunately for us, apparently didn't do anything with them, but they had the capacity to do it. So we think we're a lot smarter in protecting ourselves now, but I hope we're right. We'll find out. Here's what I want to do to bring this home from Russia to China. We know what the Chinese did in response to Hong Kong within their own country and using social media, spam accounts and other disinformation campaigns about what was happening in Hong Kong. Are we naive to believe that they would not interfere in our 2020 election campaign? And I notice a nod of negative feelings. We shouldn't be naive, I think is what you're saying. And if so, what should we be doing about this in light of the potential threat that we have? If not direct impact on our election process, disinformation campaigns coming out of China, not directed at the Hong Kong experience, but directed in ways that they think enhance their position in the United States. They may decide, Mr. Chairman, that because of your position on Tik-Tok, they want to say a few things about you. I hope not, but let's consider this possibility. What do you have to tell me?
So, Senator, one thought is I think it's important to think about how different countries operate differently and use different tools. So with China, I see a pattern of using economic leverage to translate that leverage into policy. So one example would be retaliating against a university if they invite a speaker that the Chinese government doesn't like. Another example would be suggesting to a US businessman that if it would be very good for him and his interests in China if he communicated a certain message to the Hill or to an elected official. And I don't know that everyone will think about FARA or statutes like FARA that are designed to promote transparency when there's an instance like that. So I think we've got to be plain spoken about the different risks the countries face, and I think we have to invest in transparency measures like FARA to ensure we're surfacing instances like that, because I think that's the vector that I see from our cases is more likely.
So let's stick with FARA for just a minute here. In recent years, DOJ has required leading Chinese state-run media organizations to register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, which requires individuals and entities representing a foreign principal through political or advocacy work to publicly register with the Department of Justice, disclose their activities, and maintain written records. According to DOJ records, there are currently only 28 entities with active FARA registrations associated with China. 28. So I ask you, is the department considering expanding the scope of organizations with Chinese ties to register under FARA?
I'd have to go check the numbers myself, Senator. I can't vouch for them sitting here today. But we certainly consider China one of the principles that we would prioritize in our FARA inquiries and investigations.
Any other comment from the other witnesses?
I did want to mention, so yesterday, of course, Super Tuesday, at CISA, we hosted both unclassified and classified operation centers to work with state and local election officials and to coordinate with the intelligence community and our law enforcement partners to ensure that that part of the elections were secure. And so to the original point of your question, when it comes to protecting the election infrastructure, the voting infrastructure, we're agnostic of the threat actor, whether it's Russians or Chinese or any others. And it is our belief, advised by our IC partners, that there are many nations that may have designs or desires to in some way influence or affect our elections, and we prepare for all of them.
Can I branch out in another area that's come to our attention recently, and that's the involvement of the Chinese at our universities, in research students as well as faculty members. One major university, I won't name it, a major science department at that major university, they believe was recently compromised when the head of the department was receiving regular remuneration from the Chinese Communist Party or government. Can you tell me, perhaps, Mr. Wallace, is this a serious problem that we need to focus on? I think in our own terms, we have many outstanding Chinese students at our universities in Illinois, and some of them stay and do wonderful things. Others, obviously, are there for a different purpose. What's the reality?
No, I think you're absolutely correct, and that's our counterintelligence division working very closely with the cyber division. Once again, this is one of the tentacles of the whole of society approach that the Communist Party is pushing to gain intelligence. They do that in the universities to undermine our R&D projects, right? So that they cut in half the amount, or not even half, of what it would take to build a product, because they steal the technology. So we have an aggressive outreach program in our counterintelligence division with the academia to ensure that we get them up to speed on what those threats are. And that's a robust program that our counterintelligence division has. From the cyber perspective, we see the exact same position. Placement and access from an insider that gets onto the systems of a university that has the ability to look at those programs creates a cyber intrusion threat, potentially to steal that information, with the goal of furthering their programs over there with the hard work that our universities are doing around those programs.
I just close by saying we are all consumed by the coronavirus. We know its origin appears to have been in China. There have been some wild-eyed, unsubstantiated theories as to what the Chinese might have been doing there. And I just hope we take care to guard our national integrity, of course, but not to engage in this wild speculation that has no basis in fact.
Thank you, Senator Durbin. Mr. Hickey, I'm going to come back to you. I've got a few additional questions. Something you said a moment ago about leverage. You're concerned about companies that do business here but report to parent companies in China. You're concerned about the leverage the parent company may have. Can you expand on that? Because I think that's really quite important.
Sure. So I think a Chinese company doing business here is obviously subject to our laws, but will be reporting back to a company in China. And I'll give you an example from one of our indictments. Huawei is indicted in Seattle. And I should be clear, this is an indictment. These are allegations, and the company's presumed innocent until we prove our case beyond a reasonable doubt. But at least according to the allegations in the indictment, Huawei, which had engineers and folks working here as well as in China, corporate Huawei wanted trade secrets from T-Mobile. It was doing business with T-Mobile, and the employees working here said, we can't get those. We're subject to an NDA. We're not allowed to take this particular technology. So according to the indictment, the parent company sent engineers here under the guise of being employees to do business here, but in fact, were given the direction to steal that technology since the US employees didn't seem to be up to the task. And at or around this time, according to the indictment, a memo goes out company-wide saying, in substance, if you take information as proprietary and it's valuable, we'll reward you. So send it to this secure email box. That's what concerns me, is that companies doing business here are nominally subject to our laws, but may also be following directions from abroad. And so you have to think about whether that parent company operates in an environment where it is either going to respect our laws because it's in its interest to do so, or is it going to follow a different directive?
Let me ask you, CFIUS has tools to block acquisitions, in some cases to unwind acquisitions by foreign companies of American-based companies. Do you feel that you have adequate tools when a nation state, let's say China, instead of acquiring a company, just introduces an app into the American market? It seems to me there'd be similar security concerns, could be similar security concerns in terms of the amount of data that they could gather. Does CFIUS have tools that you need to address that kind of scenario?
I think the committee would probably say that threat falls outside what CFIUS should do, but that doesn't mean it isn't a threat worth addressing. And I think the president and the administration recognized this last May when it issued the executive order on securing the information and telecommunications supply chain. A bit of a mouthful. But the long and the short of it is we shouldn't just be concerned about investments of capital here. There may be purchases of products and goods and services from outside the US that could pose a telecommunications or security threat or national security threat. And so that EO lays out a broad framework for how to address a situation like that. Commerce is working on implementing regulations which aren't finalized yet, but in a certain circumstance, that's where I think that problem would be addressed, or that threat would be addressed.
Let me come back finally just to the parent company situation again. In a Homeland Security hearing late last year, Director Wray said that he was concerned about U.S. companies doing business with China or storing data in China because, and I'm going to quote him now, Chinese law, this is him, Chinese law essentially compels Chinese companies and typically compels U.S. companies that are operating in China to have relationships with different kinds of Chinese companies to provide whatever information the government wants whenever it wants, end quote. That seems like a really high security risk. Do you agree?
Yes.
And it gets to your point, I think, that if you have an American company that has a Chinese parent counterpart that is compelled under Chinese law to share data with the Chinese government or to use networks that are controlled by the Chinese government, we have a major security problem. Is that correct?
We could. I mean, again, when you talk about a company doing business here, I think differently about a subsidiary of a Chinese company versus an American company headquartered here, which has some market incentive, right, to take care that its data is held securely. But that's what we're relying on, is market incentives. So those can shift with time and with business ambition. So it's something worth thinking about.
Very good. Senator Whitehouse, do you have anything further?
Just a question for the record, if I might, to Mr. Wallace. Many, many years ago, I think Microsoft was the first entity to go to court in a civil action, an ex parte civil action, and ask the court for permission to shut down a bot that was attacking or using Microsoft as its target. Shortly thereafter, one of the U.S. Attorney's offices pulled together a team that went after another array of bots, and in a similar civil action, went to court and said, I'd like permission to knock these bots down. Anybody who cares to dispute me can show up in court. Please come. We'd love to put handcuffs on you when you show. Nobody showed. They got the order and, again, cleaned up the bots. That then turned into a more robust and more constant. As soon as that episode was concluded, that shut down. but the department picked that up again and has had a more continuing effort at what I would call bot rooting. Back to my argument about weeding in the garden. If you never weed, you get a garden that's overrun with weeds. If you weed constantly, and I think we've had repeated testimony in this committee that really no good comes from bots. They're pretty much weeds only. I'd love to get a written response to this question for the record that gives me a current update on where you are on that civil ex parte case bot uprooting program, where you're just going through and helping the private sector disable them whenever they rear their ugly little heads. Okay, understood?
Yes, sir.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Senator Durbin, anything further? No. All right. Thank you very much, panelists. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your work. We'll just take a second here and invite the second panel to come forward. Well, very good. We're delighted to have a second panel of experts to continue this topic. And Senator Durbin mentioned just a moment ago that Apple had again declined our request to come and testify. TikTok has again declined our request to come and testify. So maybe, Senator Durbin, we ought to make it a tradition in this hearing room. We'll just provide an open chair. I just say again to Apple and TikTok that you have relevant testimony to give. If indeed there's nothing that you're afraid of, that there's nothing that you're afraid to defend, come to this committee, come to this hearing room, take an oath like these other witnesses have done, and testify. Provide relevant testimony. Tell us about what you're doing in China. Tell us about your relationship with Beijing. Tell us about the kind of labor in Apple's case and maybe TikTok's that you rely upon. We'd love to hear it. It's very relevant. And the American public, I think, more to the point, the American public deserves to know. So we have open spots for them. We'll continue to do so anytime we address this topic. And I hope that they may see fit to actually answer some questions. We're delighted to have the second panel. Let me introduce them, and then I will swear them. We'll follow the same practice as before. We'll admit your comments for the record, but we'll move straight to questions. Let me start with Ms. Sam Sachs. She's the Cybersecurity Policy and China Digital Economy Fellow at New America, where she leads the Data and Great Power Competition Project. Her research focuses on emerging information and communication technology policies globally, particularly in China. Thank you for being here, Ms. Sachs. And then Mr. Derek Scissors is resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on the Chinese and Indian economies and on U.S. economic relations with Asia. He is also chief economist of the China Beige Book, which provides large-scale data on the Chinese economy. If you'd be willing to stand, I'll administer a note to you. If you'd raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Okay. Thank you all for being here. Let me begin, Ms. Sachs, by talking with you. Last November, our hearing on this subject revealed that Chinese law requires companies like Apple or others who do business in the country to hand over data on request to the Communist Party. According to a number of recent reports, however, there are new regulations that may go further. These reports state that China now requires companies like Apple to use government-approved network equipment that is fully open, by all accounts, to Chinese officials, which means that no longer can companies like Apple try to say that their systems in China are secure, their own systems, or that they won't hand over data, but they're actually being required to use Chinese-approved, government-approved networks, and China doesn't even need permission anymore. So let me just ask you, Ms. Sachs, to your knowledge, where do most cybersecurity assaults or cyber assaults typically come from? Can you push your, yeah.
At the outset, let's distinguish two distinct sets of risk. One is what companies like Apple face in China, where they primarily handle Chinese citizen data, whereas TikTok would primarily, operating overseas, would primarily handle US citizen data. The first is really an ethical question, and here it's a minefield, whether we're talking about pressure from the Chinese government to hand over data on dissidents, digital content censorship as a precondition for market access, even the potential that technology could be used in supply chains to enable the mass incarceration of Muslims in Xinjiang, right? These are primarily ethical issues. I think that these are bigger and more complex problems than individual companies are prepared to handle themselves while operating in China. But I will say that neither extreme, the idea that no threat exists or that we should sever all research and commercial ties with China, neither of these extremes serve US interests and values. And we can talk about how to do that. Now, as for TikTok, and specifically the question of Chinese government access to data, you're correct that a number of different Chinese laws and regulations and standards provide authorities for the government to essentially require anything that they want of these companies. I will say from my experience, my observations are somewhat different, and they don't necessarily lend themselves to nice sound bites. There's a massive gray zone. It's a negotiation. There are conflicting interests, whether it's the multi-level protection scheme, whether it's the new cryptography law. I think we often forget that Chinese corporate actors are not synonymous with the Communist Party of China nor the Chinese government. And oftentimes local officials have economic interests in their jurisdictions, which oftentimes is a backstop for how far they will go in actually requiring data access. Chinese private sector companies routinely push back on data requests by the government. They don't want to come forward publicly about this because doing so makes it look like they're resisting their government. So now, I've struggled with how to present this information. Why, if we end up at the same conclusion that we can't guarantee that that data would not be accessed by the Chinese government because of lack of clarity of law, because of lack of oversight mechanisms, because there's no real channel to contest it, why do lawmakers even need to understand that that gray zone, that push and pull exists in the Chinese system? And I think the answer that I've come to is because only by understanding the complexity of Chinese system on the ground can lawmakers actually create effective and responsible policies to address those risks. And I'd be happy to give some suggestions about that.
Very good, thank you. Mr. Scissors, let me turn to you. You are an expert on the Chinese market, on the United States interface with the Chinese market, and you have written about American companies' dependence on the Chinese market. Can you tell us something about the leverage, to pick up a term used in our earlier panel, the leverage that American companies' increasing the dependence, the location of our supply chains, for instance, in China, the kind of leverage that creates for either Chinese corporations or Beijing when they're interfacing with American companies, say tech companies?
I can certainly do that. To try to keep it simple, let's talk about the companies themselves in the context of export controls. As you know, the Congress passed on an overwhelming bipartisan basis a requirement that export controls be updated and upgraded. The Department of Commerce has not produced very much in the way of implementing regulations. And in that process, we've had American companies say repeatedly, we can't innovate as well without China. They say this over and over and over again. So we can, I put some in my written testimony, some numbers, and we can check those and talk about them. They're considerable with regard to U.S. affiliate sales in China, but they're telling us something very clearly. We can't innovate as well without China. It would really hurt us. We also know the Chinese government has a plan to acquire innovation from everywhere they can. They're going to become more dependent on innovation. They admit this. As their country ages, because of the debt they've accumulated, they're accumulating more debt today as we speak. So we can't innovate nearly as well without China, a Chinese government that really wants to acquire any innovation it can. And that's, to me, why you don't have companies who want to come testify. Because they're telling you, we are transferring technology to China because we need China to innovate and they want the tech. And we can argue about the details, but the two main forces on both sides of the relationship say the US companies need to transfer technology to China to maintain their position there.
And just to be clear, when it comes to Chinese corporations, the Chinese government's interest in this, because they need innovation and they need to import it, or they have an incentive to try and collect information from Americans. They have an incentive to try and partner or acquire American companies. They have an incentive to try to gather our data and our info. Is that fair to say? I mean, is that a fair simplification? And so there's a profit motive, if you like. I mean, for them, it's not just profits; it's national security. It's everything. But the motive is very, very strong on the part of Chinese corporations and the Chinese government. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I focus on the economic dimension. That's where my expertise is. It's not on the national security side. But you're absolutely right. There is a domestic political incentive to monitor the population. There's an overseas propaganda and foreign policy incentive, as well as the economic incentive. So the Chinese have a multi-dimensional incentive to extract information from American tech firms.
Yeah, and they've been doing that very successfully. Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks, Chairman. Ms. Sachs, it's great to see somebody who graduated from Brown University here. Hope you were.
And Yale Law School. I'm now a senior fellow at Yale Law School as well.
There you go. So Rhode Islanders are glad that you're here, and I hope you enjoyed your years with us. Some time ago, we came pretty close to negotiating a cybersecurity critical infrastructure bill. And the model that we were talking about, we called Fort Cyber, for want of a better term. And Fort Cyber was aligned with your small yard, high fence analogy, which is that you let most of the internet stay the wild, wild west, because who cares? But certain things, like our military networks, like our defense industrial base, like other elements of critical infrastructure, would be able to find some heightened degree of sanctuary and protection, and also be evaluated for their self-protection in Fort Cyber. And that blew up, despite the fact that the bill was being negotiated with the number 2 on the Republican side, when the number 1 on the Republican side went to the floor and said, this bill isn't going to pass without repeal Obamacare attached to it. So a lot of effort gone to naught. But I still think that the idea is a sensible one. We obviously do that with our military and intelligence networks. The defense industrial base has heightened standards that it has to meet in order to qualify as the defense industrial base. What is your advice to us if we were to take a look now at our critical infrastructure protections, and at a very general level, what do you think the steps are that need to be taken? And a related question is, does the Nist framework do the job? Can we just say, okay, Nist framework has done this, we don't need to worry about this any longer? My sense is the Nist framework has never been stress tested, is 7 years old now, and needs to be reevaluated, and in any event, probably was never good enough to begin with, just so I'm disclosing my point of view here. Would you respond to that? And if you need more time to respond by writing something down or providing me an article that is relevant in terms of a QFR, please do so.
Sure. Well, I absolutely agree, Senator, that the U.S. government should ensure that U.S. critical infrastructure is protected from cyber threat. And CI critical infrastructure providers would be well advised to use the NIST framework. I think we're at a moment where it would be worth exploring whether the NIST framework itself needs to be strengthened, whether there's a need for further, more mandatory measures. That, of course, would come with additional questions, right? What are the costs? What would be the costs of making that mandatory? Whether it is in terms of the speed that technology develops, and whether a mandatory measure would be able to keep pace with that, whether it's about the impact of smaller firms. But I think what's become clear is that there is a sort of gap in terms of NIST originally being focused on more traditional kinds of information technology. Now we're seeing an expanded surface attack, threat surface. So whether it's cloud computing, Internet of Things, operational technology, OT, which is on the industrial side, I think it's certainly worth Congress exploring how an updated version, we can put in place more robust rules. And to the point on the previous panel, this is not just about Beijing. This is much bigger. And I think we need rules, more robust cybersecurity rules for all companies. You know, Equifax and TikTok, neither of them should be allowed to collect and retain the amount of personal data that they have, because that will be exposed to whether it's state actors or whether it's a commercial transfer back to Beijing. And this is certainly one tool to do that.
Good. Well, thank you. I hope that the committee will follow up. We did some very, very good work in the past on trying to define what protections make the most sense for critical infrastructure, defining what is critical infrastructure, defining what standards is the right word, because as soon as you post a standard, the adversary defeats it. So it's more a system or a referee who has to keep track of whether you're utilizing best practices. But I feel that we've let that drop in Congress. I feel that the Nist process is the best available out there, but that doesn't mean that it actually is doing the job, either in terms of who's participating or how good the defenses are. And, well, let me just end there.
Senator, can I make a 15-second comment?
Please.
I'm not an expert, as Ms. Sachs is in this field, but I'm an expert on Chinese incentives in companies. And whatever our defense is, there has to be an element of punishment. We can have a very high bar, and I think that's appropriate. But what you don't want to have is a system where, like, hey, we've stopped 99% of cyber threats, and there's no punishment for continuing to act that way because the incentive will say, we get away with it. We didn't win this time. We'll just keep trying.
Yeah.
So whatever framework Congress creates, and I don't want punishment to be, frequent, repeat bad actors need to face some consequences, or there's no deterrence effect.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is worth sanctions. And I was at least a fly on the wall to the conversations within the Obama administration about whether to indict the Chinese military officers who were involved in critical infrastructure attacks and intellectual property theft in our country. And there was enormous pushback from the diplomatic side, from commerce and the trade side, and from big businesses that didn't want to have the Chinese patrons offended. They had important businesses over there and they didn't want any pushback. So it actually took a lot of guts for Attorney General Holder to go ahead and insist on those indictments and do them. And as it turned out, I think it worked rather well. It did seem to blow back some of the behavior for a while. And there did not seem to be enormous consequences either in commerce or at state or against individual American companies. But the reaction to that idea of American agencies and American companies saying, oh no, don't do anything that would discomfort the Chinese, we need them, has created a kind of secondary layer of influence that the Chinese can deploy that is unfortunate. So I take your point and just add that as a point of reference around it. Thanks.
Senator Durbin.
Thanks again. Ms. Sachs, you open your testimony before the committee in saying that you're arguing for maintaining openness of the U.S. system, greater resilience, and new guardrails to ensure that openness is not exploited. Let me bring it on home to you to my example I mentioned earlier. What's happening on campuses and universities across America with Chinese students. I am a person who favors immigration. I believe that trade between our countries is important when it comes to China, and it is growing and will continue to, I'm sure. And I certainly believe in universities and what they stand for, globally and domestically. And yet there is a reality here, a reality of Communist Party espionage, corporate espionage, things that are raising serious questions about whether we have the necessary guardrails to protect the openness of our society. You're a lot closer to the college experience in your life than I am in mine. Can you reflect on what you've seen and what you think we should be doing?
Thank you, Senator Durbin. And I'd also like to bring home a reality to you all from what it's like to be a Chinese student at an American university today. Xenophobia and racism are rising. Not all Chinese students are spies, and the reality is that Chinese students feel caught between two worlds. One, a communist party in China that is monitoring and tracking and trying to censor what they say on campuses here, and a law enforcement community that is harassing them and making them feel unwelcome. They're caught between two worlds. They can't win. And I think what we need to do is make those students feel more welcome here while continuing to give our law enforcement and intelligence services the capacity to investigate and to pursue where there are legitimate threats. Not every Chinese student is a spy, but some are, and we need to be able to strike that balance, and so far we are not.
So one thing we did, at least some places, was to close Confucian centers that were student unions, I suppose, for Chinese national students, and unfortunately came up with enough information to raise questions as to whether they were dangerous when it came to these issues of corporate and national security. Tell me, I want to strike the balance that you're speaking to here. What is the right way to do that and not close our eyes to our vulnerabilities in this open country we live in?
To be frank, I don't think that Confucius Institutes are the problem. I mean, there was a Government Accountability Office report. It's about 200 pages long, this GO report. It specifically looked at, in a very objective, fact-based way, whether Confucius Institutes are spreading CCP influence campaigns and what the effects are. There was really nothing there that they found in the report. Confucius Institutes, in many cases, are providing language instruction. I have a 6-year-old boy who I'm very eager to have him start studying Chinese, and there are not a lot of resources in schools for Chinese language study. So why don't we do a better job of funding language study so we're not dependent on having Confucius Institutes to come do that for us, right? I just think that we're looking in the wrong places. You know, what's clear is we need new guardrails. The openness of the US system has been exploited. My question is, are we putting those guardrails in the right places?
Okay, I think we're on the same track here. I hope we can develop the thought beyond that. Dr. Scissors, would you like to comment on this?
I mean, I taught a Chinese economy course for about 15 years at GW. And none of the students, most of the students by the end were mainland Chinese students. And none of them were a danger to the United States. I don't care what they were doing. They were 20-year-old college students who couldn't even understand intermediate macroeconomics. I think there's a huge difference. It's not my fault, really. I think there's a huge difference between normal Chinese students on campus, which is whatever, 90%, 95%, and Chinese researchers in labs with advanced technology. I mean, I as somebody who was sort of a participant in this for a long time, I don't understand why we don't say these are areas of sensitive technology. You cannot have Chinese nationals working on these projects. I don't care that it inconveniences you. You can't do it. And yet the rest of the students, it's not a national security matter. It's not a matter of theft of very valuable trade secrets. It's a campus political matter that we can monitor much more easily. So my split is about, is there a sensitive technology here or not?
I will tell you, when I raised that very point with some of the university leaders in my own state, they said, but Senator, it turns out the best and brightest students in these fields are from China. And there are no American students who can parallel their expertise in dealing with these issues and subjects. So for them, it was a dilemma whether they'll just close down the research operation.
Well, that may refer back to Ms. Sachs's talk about investment, but I know that 20 years ago, they didn't say that because we didn't have a flood of Chinese students. So it's not impossible for us to be a very innovative, prosperous country without Chinese students working in American labs. And in fact, it seemed like we were doing it pretty easily for a long time. So perhaps Congress can look at recreating the conditions that allowed American research to thrive in the 1990s and into the 2000s.
Well, I'm continuing to push more federal dollars into federal research with an amendment on the floor for the Office of Science and the Department of Energy for 5% real growth. We've done it in NIH on a bipartisan basis. Your colleague, Senator Blunt, has been a leader on that. And I hope that we do make that investment and take it down to the lower level in STEM subjects so that we have American students who can excel in ways that they're not doing today. But thank you both for your testimony.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel. Actually, there is a hearing going on right now in the Energy and Water Subcommittee of Appropriations where the Secretary of Energy is literally testifying about what is the dollar amount we should be putting in to quantum computing, to artificial intelligence, to a whole range of new technologies. And Argonne National Lab was specifically recognized for its national leadership in large-scale computing. But again, there's a big difference between the administration's budget and the very bipartisan response from the senators, which is we need to invest more in these next generation technologies. As we all know, there are significant advances in a whole series of fields that will create millions of jobs and tremendous opportunities that have security implications, but also implications across our whole economy. I want to focus on one specific issue, which is standard setting, and the ways in which China saw 3G and 4G pass them by. We have fought relentlessly to reinforce and strengthen the global system that protects intellectual property and sets standards. The Chinese have figured this out, and they are aggressively engaging. There was an election, I think yesterday perhaps, about the new head of the World Intellectual Property Organization. To my relief, someone who is from a country with a strong focus on protecting IP rights was the successful competitor. My argument would be there was a Chinese national who was there largely to undermine IP rights. Ms. Sachs, you've written about China's efforts to influence international standards organizations, specifically regarding AI. Can you describe in greater detail the strategies China is using to influence standard-setting bodies, and what do you see as the national security risks if China's strategies are successful in overtaking or significantly influencing most of the standard-setting bodies?
The Chinese government recognizes that they didn't have a seat at the table when the standards for the internet as we know it were set. And with 5G, they've gotten ahead of the curve. You mentioned AI, and I'll mention that in a moment. I think there are distinct issues related to AI and 5G standards. With 5G, there is no question that Chinese telecom companies, Huawei and others, are sending more representatives to vote and influence the setting of 5G standards. On the U.S. side, I think that there's a number of things that we can do to increase the voice and the influence of American companies in that process. Restricting U.S. companies from participating in standard setting along with Huawei, I think has undermined our ability to do that, and that's something that we need to revisit. When it comes to AI, there's an active effort in China among scholars, policymakers, and industry to get ahead of the curve in setting standards around things like AI bias, safety, and ethics. This is something where the U.S. has an opportunity to lead in this area, and we need to step up to the table. The rules for these new technologies have yet to be written, and China's already rapidly moving to the table to do it. I will say one thing, though. This is also an area where we should be probably working with China on this. We know that they are actively considering things. I know we have a bill that's under consideration on algorithmic transparency. There are similar discussions taking place in China, but the question is, how are we thinking about these issues? Is there an opportunity for convergence? I would also argue that there's a national security risk if we do decouple with China and lose visibility into the way they are thinking about these issues. That is probably far more dangerous to U.S. interests.
Thank you for referencing the Algorithmic Fairness Bill, which essentially says if you are using an algorithm to determine eligibility for something, whether it's a mortgage loan or admission to a university, and it has a demonstrably disparate impact on protected groups, you have to be able to show how the algorithm produced that outcome, something that's currently largely opaque. But you also have to provide protections for trade secrets. Just thank you for the plug. Let me just ask both of you whether you think we've got a coordinated plan for developing and advocating standards around AI and 5G, and I recognize the difference between them, and whether you think the folks we're sending to standard-setting bodies have the right expertise in that balance between civil liberties and national security to advocate for our interests.
I'll take the more general answer. I don't see how we can have a coordinated plan because I don't think we've decided, and I'm very sympathetic to the views here and a lot of views of members of Congress, but I don't think Congress has decided, and I definitely don't think the administration has decided about our level of commitment to globalization, and I don't mean that as an unvarnished positive. To pick off of Sam's remarks, I am much more negative about our ability to cooperate with the Chinese under this government, under Xi Jinping. But we're giving up on globalization if we don't go to standards bodies and defend it. Right. We're about to, we have a new program taking on the WTO where our commitment to globalization is also in question. I understand those questions. I'm not sure we can work with the Chinese under Xi. But first we have to answer whether we want to go to standards bodies and set up global standards, even though the Chinese are going to cause us problems. And if we don't, then we need to set up standards bodies without them. I don't think that question has been answered. I'm not accusing anyone here of doing it. It's mostly a media construction. There's total decoupling, and then there's nothing. Of course, that's not the choice. Right. But the first question we have to answer is where's an acceptable outcome on standards bodies? For us, where we are willing to work with the Chinese? And do we think we can get that with the current Chinese government, as opposed to a previous government which was more cooperative? My answer is probably no, but I don't think we've answered the question in order to start having a plan.
And if I might, as you follow up on that, Ms. Sachs, it's obviously not a bipolar world. The world has many more players than just the United States and China when it comes to standard setting and technologies. One question would be, since complete decoupling and complete partnership are these false poles, is there some role for a technology alliance, for a multilateral effort with countries that have a similar commitment to open societies, are also very interested in and engaged in innovation, but may look at IP protection and standards more similarly to how we do than the Chinese? Ms. Sachs.
Absolutely, there is. I think the most important area of conflict that we need to address is between the EU and the United States on this. And here is where, returning to the conversation of how important it is to put forward a U.S. vision of internet governance and cybersecurity, right. This would go a long way, I think, towards creating more convergence with our European partners on this. I think with the Europeans, with the Japanese, there's absolutely an opportunity, whether it's around cross-border data flows and putting in place safeguards to facilitate that, whether it's in terms of algorithmic transparency and the rules around these disruptive technologies.
This field's moving very quickly, and Congress is not moving as quickly, and so I think we've got a critical role here to play.
You're a master of understatement.
Indeed I am, Senator. And it's just a reminder that we've got critical opportunities here that we're missing to contribute. I recognize this hearing's gone on for quite some time, so let me simply say, Ms. Sachs, if you'd like to be in a state where every elementary school child has the opportunity to learn Chinese, explore Delaware, something our previous governor made part of the curriculum for every elementary school. I do think, just a final editorial comment, that the credibility and the relevance of our leadership on IP issues like standard setting in part depends on our having a strong IP system domestically. And we have done things that have weakened our own IP system that I think were needless self-harms that have put to question our commitment to robust innovation and the protection of invention in ways that we should be addressing at the same time we are trying to engage effectively with our allies. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. To our witnesses, thank you. And thank you for your work in this field.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Mr. Scissors, I just have a couple of final questions for you as we wrap up. We talked a moment ago about the incentives on the Chinese side to import innovation, steal innovation, get American tech companies into China, scoop up Americans' data. But what about the incentives on the American side, the American tech companies side? I mean, we read reports about Google, for instance, and their hunger and thirst to be in the Chinese market, or Facebook, the same thing, the compromises that these companies are willing to go to in terms of content moderation, willing to partner with the Beijing government and developing platforms that will censor content, for instance, all of that to gain access to the Chinese market. Tell us something, why these companies might be so eager, these big tech companies, to gain access to the Chinese market, to partner with the Chinese government where necessary. What's their incentive structure?
I don't mean to be blithe about this, but, it's money. When you look at sales by U.S. affiliates in China, the most recent U.S. government data puts it at close to $400 billion in 2017. It probably rose since then. May not be rising very quickly at this point, but it's probably over $400 billion. We have a handful of U.S. companies that are important on the NASDAQ that get 30% or more of their revenue from China. To add to that, an economic point, people have this idea that China is a rich country. It's not anywhere close to a rich country. Chinese average income is about 1/11 that of the U.S. if you actually measure what they have, not using GDP per capita, but actual money in their pockets. If you have a positive view of Chinese spending on technology, there's a lot of growth left. And I think these companies feel like, well, okay, now I see China slowing down and struggling with their various issues, but there's still a chance that they're going to grow fast for a while because they're much poorer than the United States. Whereas in the US, 2%, that's what we got. China may be slowing to 2%, but I still got a shot at 6%. So not only is there a lot of money, but there's potential for future money. And I think that second part is still the draw because they don't, if we had an alternative for American firms, and we're seeing this with coronavirus, oh, well, we're going to move supply chains out of China. Oh, that's nice. Where are you moving them to? If we had an alternative for American firms that they thought the Indian or the Indonesian or ASEAN markets were going to grow really fast, they'd leave. There are a lot of problems in China. They complain a lot, as I'm sure you know, Senator. Behind closed doors, they complain a lot. But what they don't have is the volume of sales and the growth. They have the volume of sales in rich countries. They have the growth in other countries. But China is the one that gives them the potential for both.
And I just want to drill down on the point. I think you've written elsewhere that the American companies that are most dependent on the Chinese market are tech companies, as you just said. I mean, some of them receive about 30% or more of their revenue from China. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Oh, so there's a very significant monetary interest on the side of these major American tech companies in not only doing business in China, but to some extent pacifying the Chinese government, just as there is a very intense interest on the Chinese side in getting these companies to sign these joint venture agreements, to share their technology, to share their platforms, and in many instances to share Americans' data. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, just to drive that point home, China reserves huge swaths of its economy for state-owned enterprises, gives them monopolies. Those companies don't innovate. This idea that China innovates when the private sector is allowed to innovate, it doesn't innovate in state monopolies, which means they're going to need those American companies for an indefinite period of time.
Very good. Well, I think when you've got the incentive structures it's set up now with American companies that have an incentive to do business in China and to make compromises, including with our data in China, and Chinese companies and the Chinese government that has every incentive to acquire as much information as they can from as many Americans as they can, you've got the kind of security problem that we're currently facing. Senator Whitehouse, anything further?
No, I'm good. I think if you have any thoughts on the question for the previous panel, was asked about what a coalition of the willing might look like and where the sweet spots are for agreements that we could enter into to create a better international environment, that would be of interest to me. Question to both of you, if you would like to answer for the record. Thanks. Thanks, Chairman.
Ms. Sachs, Mr. Scissors, thank you so much for your testimony, and thanks to all of you for being here today. With that, the hearing's concluded.